The text message arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, right as I was finishing my threat assessment report for the morning briefing. It was from my brother Kevin, and it was just 4 words that would change everything between us forever. "We need your help." No pleasantries, no how are you. Just those 4 words from the same person who, 3 months earlier, had stood in our parents' kitchen laughing about my glorified desk job, while everyone nodded along like it was the most brilliant observation they'd ever heard. The same brother who'd introduced me to his tech friends as Sarah. She works for the government doing paperwork stuff, with that dismissive wave of his hand that made me feel invisible in my own family. I stared at that message for a full minute before setting my phone face down on my desk. I didn't respond, not immediately. Because for the first time in 15 years of working as an intelligence analyst for the Department of Homeland Security, for the first time since I'd earned my top secret clearance and spent countless nights reviewing classified materials that could impact national security, someone in my family actually needed what I had built. And they had no idea just how much power that gave me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Martinez, and I've spent the last decade and a half being the family disappointment. Not the dramatic kind where you get disowned or cut off, but the quiet kind where you become background noise at family gatherings. The one whose achievements get a polite "that's nice, honey," before the conversation shifts to Kevin's latest startup venture or Jessica's growing Instagram following. I grew up in Scottsdale, Arizona, in one of those suburban neighborhoods where every house looks almost identical except for the color of the garage door. My father, Robert Martinez, built half the commercial developments in Phoenix through his construction company. My mother, Linda, sells million-dollar homes to tech executives who move here from California. Success in my family has always been measured in dollar signs and social media metrics, which made my choice to work for the federal government seem not just boring, but actively puzzling to them. When I graduated from Arizona State University in 2009 with a degree in international relations and political science, the economy was in shambles. While my classmates were struggling to find any work at all, I was offered a position as a junior analyst with the Department of Homeland Security. It wasn't glamorous. The starting salary was modest. The work was confidential, which meant I couldn't talk about most of what I did. But it was stable, meaningful, and it came with something my family never bothered to understand: the opportunity to serve something bigger than myself. The first few years were rough. I worked long hours, analyzing threat patterns, reviewing intelligence reports, and slowly earning the trust of my supervisors. My family would ask what I did all day, and when I gave vague answers about data analysis and security assessments, they'd lose interest immediately. Kevin, fresh out of business school and launching his first tech startup, would roll his eyes whenever I mentioned work. Jessica, who was building her personal brand as a lifestyle influencer, would change the subject to something more interesting. But I loved what I did. I was good at it. Really good. By my 3rd year, I was handling cases that required higher clearance levels. By year 5, I had my top secret clearance. By year 10, I was managing a team of analysts and briefing senior officials on matters that could affect national security policy. I had access to information and resources that most people couldn't even imagine existed. None of this impressed my family. At Christmas dinners, Kevin would talk about his startup's latest funding round while everyone hung on his every word. Jessica would show off her sponsored content deals and vacation photos from brand partnerships. My parents would beam with pride, asking detailed questions and offering enthusiastic support. When the conversation turned to me, I'd mention a commendation I'd received or a training program I'd completed, and the response was always the same: polite disinterest followed by someone changing the subject. The breaking point came 3 months ago at my cousin Michael's engagement party. It was held at my parents' house, a sprawling ranch-style home with a backyard pool and enough space to host the entire extended family. I had just returned from a 2-week assignment in Washington, D.C., where I'd been part of a joint task force, reviewing security protocols for critical infrastructure. It was the kind of work that required 18-hour days and the highest level of clearance. But I couldn't talk about any of the specifics. Kevin was holding court by the pool, surrounded by his startup buddies and some potential investors who'd driven down from Scottsdale's tech corridor. He was explaining his company's pivot toward defense technology, talking about how they were going to revolutionize cybersecurity for government contractors. The way he spoke, you'd think he was personally going to save America from digital threats. I was standing nearby, nursing a beer and half listening to his pitch, when one of the investors asked about his company's government connections. Kevin laughed and gestured toward me. Well, my sister works for the government, but it's not like she does anything important. Just a desk job, you know? Probably pushing papers around all day. The investor looked at me with polite curiosity. What department? Department of Homeland Security, I said quietly. Kevin jumped back in before I could say more. See? Paperwork stuff. Nothing like what we're building. We're talking about real technology, real solutions to real problems. The group laughed, and I felt that familiar sting of being dismissed. But this time was different. This time, Kevin wasn't just minimizing my work to make himself look better. He was doing it in front of people who might actually understand what I did if he'd given me the chance to explain. I excused myself and went inside, where I found my parents in the kitchen with Jessica and her boyfriend Michael. Jessica was showing them analytics from her latest sponsored post, explaining how her engagement rates were translating into brand partnerships. My mother was genuinely fascinated, asking questions about different social media platforms and how Jessica measured success. "Sarah," my father called out when he saw me, "come look at this." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jessica's going to make more money this month than some people make in a year. I walked over and glanced at Jessica's phone screen. The numbers were impressive, I had to admit. But what struck me wasn't the success itself. It was the way my parents were celebrating it. The enthusiasm, the genuine interest, the pride in their voices. "That's great, Jess," I said, and I meant it. "Really impressive." "Thanks," she said, beaming. "I've been working really hard to build my audience. It's not as easy as people think." "I'm sure it's not," I replied. Speaking of work, I just got back from D.C. I was part of a task force. Reviewing. "Oh, that's nice," my mother interrupted, already turning back to Jessica's phone. "Honey, show me that thing about the algorithm again." I stood there for a moment, watching my family get excited about Instagram metrics while completely ignoring the fact that I'd just returned from 2 weeks of classified work that actually mattered. That's when it hit me. They didn't dismiss my job because they didn't understand it. They dismissed it because they'd decided it wasn't worth understanding. I walked out to my car and sat in the driver's seat for 10 minutes before starting the engine. I didn't cry. I didn't get angry. I just felt this strange sense of clarity, like something had finally clicked into place. My family had made their choice about what they valued, and it wasn't me. The next morning, I went to work and threw myself into my cases with renewed focus. I stopped mentioning my job at family gatherings. When they asked how work was going, I gave one-word answers and changed the subject. I stopped attending every birthday party and family dinner. Not dramatically, just quietly reducing my presence until I became even more invisible than before. My supervisor, Director Patricia Williams, noticed the change in my work patterns. I was staying later, taking on additional assignments, volunteering, for the complex cases that other analysts avoided. During my quarterly review, she pulled me aside. "Martinez, you've been exceptional lately, even more so than usual. Everything okay at home? I considered telling her about the family dynamics but decided against it. Just focused on the work, ma'am. She studied me for a moment. Well, whatever's driving it, keep it up. I'm recommending you for the senior analyst position that's opening up next quarter. It comes with additional clearance levels and a significant pay increase. I thanked her and went back to my desk, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Professional pride that wasn't undermined by family indifference. The promotion came through 6 weeks later, along with access to even more classified systems and a salary that, while still modest by my family's standards, reflected the true value of my expertise. Meanwhile, Kevin's startup was struggling. The defense technology market was more complicated than he'd anticipated, and several potential government contracts had fallen through. Jessica's follower growth had plateaued, and some of her brand partnerships weren't renewing. My parents' real estate business was solid, but they were both talking about wanting to diversify into government contracting, where the real money was steady and reliable. I watched all of this from a distance, checking in occasionally, but no longer investing emotionally in their successes or failures. They'd made it clear that my world and theirs didn't intersect in any meaningful way. So when Kevin's startup finally landed a meeting with a major defense contractor, and when Jessica started talking about pivoting toward corporate clients, including federal agencies, and when my parents began seriously exploring government construction contracts, I didn't offer any insights or assistance. I didn't tell them that I knew exactly which agencies were expanding their facilities, or that I had contacts who could provide guidance on the federal contracting process, or that my security clearance and 15 years of experience had given me a network of relationships throughout the government sector that could be invaluable to their businesses. Why would I? They'd never asked. They'd never shown any interest in what I knew, or who I knew, or what I might be able to contribute to their success. As far as they were concerned, I pushed papers around all day in a windowless office, collecting a paycheck for work that didn't matter. That Tuesday night when Kevin's text arrived, I was working on a case that involved reviewing potential security vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure. It was complex, sensitive work that required coordination with multiple agencies and access to classified databases that most people didn't even know existed. I was good at this work, really good, and I was respected by my colleagues and supervisors in ways my family had never bothered to notice. I picked up my phone and looked at Kevin's message again. "We need your help." 4 words that carried 15 years of dismissal, condescension, and indifference. 4 words from someone who'd spent the last decade treating my career like a curiosity at best and a disappointment at worst. I set the phone back down and returned to my report. Whatever Kevin needed, whatever crisis had finally made him realize that his sister might actually be useful for something, it could wait until morning. I had real work to do. The next day, I woke up to 17 missed calls, 12 from Kevin, 3 from Jessica, and 2 from my mother. My phone had been on silent since the night before, a habit I'd developed to avoid being disturbed during my evening work sessions. The first voicemail was from Kevin, and his voice had a tone I'd never heard before. Not the confident entrepreneur, pitch, or the dismissive older brother attitude, but something closer to panic. "Sarah, I know it's late, but this is urgent, really urgent. My company. We've got a huge opportunity, but there's a problem with the security clearance requirements. I need to talk to you as soon as possible. Please call me back." The second voicemail was from Jessica, equally frantic. "Sarah, Kevin told me to call. You too. Something about his business deal and government stuff. I don't really understand it, but he says it's really important, and you're the only one who can help. Please call him back, okay?" The third was from my mother. "Honey, I don't know what's going on, but Kevin seems very stressed about some work situation. He keeps saying he needs to talk to you about government procedures or something. Can you please call him? He's been up all night." I listened to all 17 voicemails while getting ready for work. The progression was fascinating. Kevin's Voice went from confident to concerned to desperate over the course of 12 messages. By the final voicemail, recorded at 3:17 a.m., he was practically begging. "Sarah, please. I know I haven't always appreciated what you do, but right now, you're literally the only person who can help me save this deal. My entire company depends on this contract. Please just call me back." I finished my coffee, gathered my classified materials for the day's briefings, and drove to the federal building where I worked. The security checkpoint, the elevator ride to the 7th floor, the morning briefing with my team, the classified emails and threat assessments and interagency coordination calls all felt exactly the same as they had for the past 15 years. But something was different now. For the first time, someone in my family needed what I had built in this world they'd never bothered to understand. During my lunch break, I finally called Kevin back. Kevin answered on the first ring, which told me everything I needed to know about how desperate he was. In 15 years of being siblings, he'd never answered my calls that quickly. Usually, if he bothered to answer at all, it would be after 3 or 4 rings with a tone that suggested I was interrupting something important. "Sarah, thank God," he said, and I could hear the relief flooding his voice. "I've been trying to reach you all night." "I noticed," I said calmly, settling into my desk chair in the secure area of the federal building. Through my window, I could see downtown Phoenix stretching out toward the mountains, the same view I'd been looking at for over a decade while my family assumed I was doing nothing meaningful with my life. "What's so urgent?" There was a pause, and I could practically hear him trying to figure out how to explain whatever crisis had driven him to call his paper-pushing sister at 11:47 at night. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all of its usual confidence. "Okay, so you know how I've been working on this pivot toward defense technology? Well, we finally got a meeting with Lockheed Martin. Not just any meeting, Sarah. They want to offer us a subcontract for a major cybersecurity project. We're talking about a $15 million deal over 3 years." I waited for him to continue, knowing there was obviously more to this story. Kevin had always been good at leading with the exciting part before mentioning the complications. "The thing is," he continued, "the contract requires that key personnel have security clearances, not just basic ones, but top-secret clearances. And not just 1 or 2 people, but at least 5 team members need to be cleared before they'll even consider finalizing the agreement." "Okay," I said, still not seeing why this constituted an emergency that required 17 phone calls. "So apply for clearances. It takes time, but if the contract is worth $15 million, surely you can wait for the process to work." Kevin let out a bitter laugh. "That's what I thought too, but it turns out the security clearance process is more complicated than just filling out some forms. They want references, Sarah. Not just professional references, but people who can vouch for your character, your reliability, your patriotism. People who have known you for years and can speak to your trustworthiness." I was beginning to understand where this was heading, but I let him continue. "And here's the really fun part," Kevin said, his voice getting tighter. "The references can't just be anyone. They have to be people who either already have security clearances themselves or who are in positions of public trust. Teachers, police officers, government employees, military personnel. People who the government already trusts to evaluate other people's trustworthiness." The pieces were falling into place now. I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the city where my family had spent years dismissing my career while building their own success stories. "And you're having trouble finding references?" "It's not just me," Kevin said quickly. "It's everyone on my team who needs clearance. My co-founder Frank, my lead developer, my systems architect, my project manager. None of us really know anyone who fits those criteria. I mean, we know business people, investors, other entrepreneurs. But government employees, military people, we don't exactly move in those circles." I almost laughed at the irony. For 15 years, my family had treated my government job like it existed in some separate, irrelevant universe. They'd never shown any interest in my colleagues, my work, relationships, or the professional network I'd built within the federal system. Now, suddenly, that separate universe was the only thing standing between Kevin's company and a $15 million contract. "What about Mom and Dad?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Dad has worked on government construction projects before. Surely he knows some people." "That's what I thought too," Kevin said. "But when we looked into it, most of Dad's government contacts are contractors like him, or low-level project managers who don't have the kind of clearances that would make them suitable references. And Mom's contacts are all in real estate. They're not exactly the kind of people who can vouch for someone's national security trustworthiness." I was quiet for a moment, processing the situation. Kevin's startup, which had been positioned as the future of defense technology, was about to collapse because none of them had bothered to build relationships with the very people they claimed they were going to serve. They'd spent years networking with venture capitalists and tech entrepreneurs, but they'd completely ignored the government employees who actually understood how their industry worked. "What about Jessica?" I asked. "Maybe she knows someone." "Through her influencer network." Kevin's laugh was even more bitter this time. "Jessica's contacts are lifestyle brands and social media companies. The closest she's come to government work is that sponsored post she did for a tax preparation service last year." "So what exactly are you asking me to do?" I said, even though I already knew the answer. "I need you to be a reference," Kevin said, the words coming out in a rush. "For me, for Frank, for the whole team. You have top secret clearance. You've been with the government for 15 years. You're exactly the kind of person they're looking for. You could vouch for all of us." I sat in silence for a long moment, watching the afternoon shadows stretch across downtown Phoenix. Kevin was asking me to put my professional reputation on the line for people who had spent years treating my profession like a joke. He was asking me to use my security clearance, which I had earned through years of dedicated service and absolute integrity, to help his startup win a contract in an industry they clearly didn't understand. "Sarah." Kevin's voice was tentative now. "Are you still there?" "I'm here," I said. "I'm just thinking about what you're asking me to do." "Look, I know this is a big ask," Kevin said quickly. "And I know we haven't always. I know I haven't always appreciated what you do. But this could change everything for my company. For my whole future." "Tell me about the work," I said. "What exactly would you be doing for Lockheed Martin?" Kevin launched into a detailed explanation of the cybersecurity project, and I had to admit it sounded legitimate. They would be developing security protocols for communication systems used in defense applications. It was exactly the kind of work that required security clearances, and exactly the kind of work that could benefit from Kevin's technical expertise. But as he talked, I kept thinking about something else. I kept thinking about all the times he'd introduced me as someone who did paperwork stuff for the government. All the times he'd dismissed my work as irrelevant while building a company that ultimately depended on government contracts. All the times my family had treated my career like a consolation prize while celebrating achievements that were ultimately far less significant than what I did every day. "It sounds like important work," I said when Kevin finished his explanation. "The kind of work that requires people with absolute integrity and demonstrated commitment to national security." "Exactly," Kevin said, relief evident in his voice. "So you'll do it? You'll be our reference?" "I didn't say that," I replied calmly. "I said it sounds like important work, the kind of work that should only be done by people who truly understand and respect the responsibility that comes with access to classified information." There was another pause, longer this time. When Kevin spoke again, his voice was more careful. "Sarah, what are you trying to say?" "I'm trying to say that security clearances aren't just paperwork," I said. They're not just bureaucratic hurdles that you jump through to get lucrative contracts. They're a sacred trust between an individual and their country. When I vouch for someone's trustworthiness in matters of national security, I'm putting my own reputation and clearance at risk. I understand that, Kevin said. I really do, and I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. Do you understand it? I asked. Because 3 months ago, you stood in our parents' backyard and told a group of potential investors that I push papers around all day. You've spent years treating my job like it's meaningless bureaucracy, and now you want me to use that same job to save your company. The silence stretched out between us, and I could hear Kevin breathing on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. You're right, he said. I have said those things, and I was wrong. I didn't understand what you do, and instead of trying to learn, I just assumed it wasn't important. That was unfair to you. It was probably the closest thing to an apology I'd ever gotten from Kevin, but it felt more like damage control than genuine remorse. He needed something from me now, so suddenly my feelings mattered. I appreciate that, I said. But this isn't about hurt feelings. This is about professional judgment. When I serve as a security clearance reference, I'm making a professional assessment of someone's character, reliability, and trustworthiness. I need to be absolutely certain that the person I'm vouching for understands the gravity of what they're asking for. I do understand, Kevin insisted. This contract could set up my entire company for the future. We're talking about steady, government work for years to come. That's exactly my point, I said. You're focused on what this clearance can do for you, but what I need to know is what you'll do for the clearance. What you'll do to protect the classified information you'll have access to. What you'll do to maintain the trust that the government is placing in you. Kevin was quiet again, and I could sense that this conversation wasn't going the way he'd expected. He'd probably thought he could call me, explain the situation, and have me agree to help within 5 minutes. After all, we were family. And isn't that what family does for each other? Can we meet in person? Kevin asked finally. This feels like the kind of conversation we should have face to face. I considered his request. Part of me wanted to say no, to tell him that he'd had 15 years to have face-to-face conversations about my work, and he'd never been interested before. But another part of me was curious to see how this would play out. For the first time in our relationship, Kevin needed something from me that he couldn't get anywhere else. For the first time, the power dynamic between us was completely reversed. Fine, I said, but not at Mom and Dad's house, and not somewhere where Jessica or anyone else will be joining us. This is a professional conversation about national security, not a family meeting. Of course, Kevin said quickly. Whatever you think is best. Where do you want to meet? I looked out my window again, thinking about the comfortable world I'd built for myself in the federal sector. My colleagues respected my expertise. My supervisors valued my judgment. My work had meaning and impact that my family had never bothered to understand. But now, suddenly, one of them needed access to that world. There's a coffee shop called Desert Brew on Central Avenue, about 6 blocks from the federal building, I said. Meet me there tomorrow at 5:30. And Kevin, come, alone. Don't bring Frank or anyone else from your company. This conversation is between you and me. Absolutely, Kevin said. Thank you, Sarah. Really. I know this is complicated, but I appreciate you even considering it. After I hung up, I sat at my desk for a long time, thinking about the phone. Call. Kevin sounded genuinely desperate, which was a new experience for me. Growing up, he'd always been the golden child, the one who succeeded at everything he tried. Basketball, academics, business, relationships. Everything seemed to come easily to him while I worked twice as hard for half the recognition. But now, he needed something that all his natural talent and business connections couldn't provide. He needed credibility within the government system, and I was the only person in his life who had it. That evening, I called my colleague David Thompson, who worked in personnel security. David and I had started with the agency around the same time, and he'd become one of my closest friends within the federal system. He understood the unique challenges of working in classified environments, and he'd always been someone I could trust with sensitive questions. "Hey, Sarah," David said when he answered. "What's up?" "I need to pick your brain about something," I said. "Hypothetically, if a family member asked you to serve as a security clearance reference, what would you want to know before agreeing?" David laughed. "That's not hypothetical at all, is it? Let me guess. Someone in your family finally figured out that your boring government job might actually be useful for something." I'd complained to David before about my family's attitude toward my work, so he understood the dynamics immediately. "Something like that," I said. "What's your take on mixing family relationships with clearance references?" "It's not automatically disqualifying," David said thoughtfully. "Family members can serve as references if they have the appropriate credentials and can make objective assessments. But you have to be really careful about conflicts of interest. The investigators will ask pointed questions about your relationship with the applicant and whether that relationship affects your judgment." "What kind of questions?" "They'll want to know how well you really know the person's character, whether you've observed them in situations that test their integrity, whether you've seen them handle sensitive information appropriately, whether you trust them enough to put your own clearance at risk." That last point hit home. If I vouched for Kevin and his team, and any of them violated security protocols or mishandled classified information, it would reflect on my judgment. It could affect my own clearance and my career within the agency. "The thing is," David continued, "being a clearance reference isn't just about whether you like someone or think they're generally trustworthy. It's about whether you believe they have the specific qualities needed to handle national security, information, discretion, reliability, loyalty to the country over personal interests. It's a pretty high bar." After talking with David, I spent the rest of the evening researching Kevin's company online. I looked at their website, their press releases, their social media presence. I read interviews with Kevin and his co-founder Frank. I researched their technical capabilities and their business model. What I found was impressive but concerning. Kevin's company had real technical expertise and legitimate capabilities in cybersecurity. They weren't just trying to cash in on government contracts without providing value. But I also noticed that almost all of their marketing and public communications focused on the commercial applications of their technology. They talked about protecting corporate networks and serving enterprise clients. Government work was mentioned almost as an afterthought, a side business rather than a core mission. That told me something important about their mindset. They weren't approaching government work as a calling or a service to the country. They were approaching it as a lucrative market opportunity. There's nothing wrong with that from a business perspective. But it raised questions about whether they truly understood the responsibility that comes with handling classified information. I also looked up the specific Lockheed Martin contract they were pursuing. It was indeed a significant cybersecurity project, the kind of work that could establish Kevin's company as a serious player in the defense industry. But it was also the kind of work that required absolute discretion and unwavering commitment to security protocols. One mistake, one careless moment, one instance of putting business interests ahead of security requirements, and the consequences could be severe. The more I researched, the more I realized how much was riding on this decision. If I vouched for Kevin and his team, I wouldn't just be helping my brother's business. I'd be taking responsibility for ensuring that 5 people I barely knew were ready to handle some of the most sensitive work in the defense industry. Kevin might be my brother, but I'd seen him cut corners before. I'd watched him charm his way out of problems instead of solving them systematically. I'd observed him prioritize short-term gains over long-term stability. Those weren't necessarily disqualifying traits for an entrepreneur, but they were exactly the kinds of behaviors that could be dangerous in someone with access to classified information. That night, I lay in bed thinking about the conversation I would have with Kevin the next day. For 15 years, he'd treated my expertise as irrelevant. Now he needed that expertise to save his company. The irony was so perfect it was almost funny. But this wasn't about revenge or proving a point. This was about national security. If I was going to put my professional reputation on the line for Kevin's team, I needed to be absolutely certain they were worthy of that trust. And that meant asking them questions they probably weren't prepared to answer. The next evening, I arrived at Desert Brew 15 minutes early and chose a table in the back corner where we could talk privately. The coffee shop was busy with the after-work crowd, which provided good cover for a sensitive conversation. Kevin arrived exactly on time, looking more nervous than I'd ever seen him. He was dressed more formally than usual, in a button-down shirt and slacks instead of his typical startup casual wear. He'd even gotten a haircut since I'd seen him last. Everything about his appearance suggested he was taking this meeting seriously, which was a good start. "Thanks for meeting with me," Kevin said as he sat down across from me. "I know this isn't exactly a normal brother-sister conversation." "No, it's not," I agreed. "This is a professional consultation about national security matters. I want to make sure we're both clear about that." Kevin nodded, though I could see him struggling with the formality. We'd never had a relationship where I was the one with expertise he needed. Usually, if anyone was giving advice, it was Kevin telling me how I could improve my career or be more ambitious. "Before we start," I said, "I want you to understand something. If I agree to serve as a reference for your security clearance applications, I'm not doing it as your sister. I'm doing it as a government employee with 15 years of experience evaluating people's trustworthiness in matters of national security. That means I'll be held to the same professional standards I'd apply to anyone else." "I understand," Kevin said, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely sure what those standards entailed. "Do you?" I asked. "Because I need to know that you understand what you're really asking for. Security clearances aren't just permission slips that let you work on government contracts. They're a sacred trust between you and your country. They give you access to information that could affect national security if it falls into the wrong hands." Kevin shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Sarah, I know this is serious. I'm not treating it lightly." "Then let's start with some basic questions," I said, pulling out a small notebook. "Tell me about a time when you had access to confidential information and how you handled it." Kevin thought for a moment. "Well, when we were raising our Series A funding, we had access to confidential financial information about potential investors. We had to sign NDAs and everything. We never shared any of that information with anyone outside the team." I wrote down his answer, but I wasn't impressed. Business NDAs were standard practice, and the consequences for violating them were usually financial rather than criminal. I needed to know how he would handle information where the stakes were much higher. "What about a time when you discovered someone else mishandling confidential information?" I asked. "How did you respond?" This time, Kevin's pause was longer. "I'm not sure I understand the question." "Have you ever been in a situation where you knew someone was sharing information they shouldn't share, or accessing systems they weren't authorized to use, or cutting corners on security protocols?" I clarified. "And if so, how did you handle it?" Kevin looked genuinely confused. "I mean, in the startup world, everyone shares everything pretty freely. We don't really have those kinds of formal security protocols." That answer concerned me more than Kevin realized. In the defense industry, people who share everything pretty freely are security risks. The whole culture would have to change if his company was going to handle classified work. "Let me ask you a different question," I said. "If you discovered that one of your employees was sharing classified information with unauthorized people, what would you do?" "I'd fire them immediately," Kevin said without hesitation. "And then what?" Kevin looked puzzled. "What do you mean, and then what? Would you report it to the appropriate authorities? Would you investigate how the breach occurred? Would you review your security protocols to prevent future incidents? Oh, Kevin said, clearly not having thought through the implications. Yes, of course. All of that. But his tone suggested he was guessing rather than demonstrating real understanding of security procedures. I made more notes, feeling less confident about his readiness for classified work. We continued talking for over an hour, and the more questions I asked, the more obvious it became that Kevin and his team were completely unprepared for the reality of working with classified information. They understood cybersecurity from a technical perspective, but they had no experience with the human factors that made security clearances necessary in the first place. They'd never worked in environments where casual conversations could constitute security breaches. They'd never had to compartmentalize information or limit their discussions based on who else was in the room. They'd never experienced the constant awareness that comes with handling information that could affect national security. As our conversation continued, I realized that Kevin still didn't fully understand what he was asking me to do. He thought serving as a reference was just a favor one professional does for another. He didn't grasp that I would be staking my own reputation and clearance on his team's ability to handle the most sensitive work in the defense industry. By the time we finished talking, I knew what my answer would be. I didn't give Kevin my answer that night. Instead, I told him I needed time to consider his request and that I'd be in touch within a week. The disappointment on his face was obvious, but he tried to hide it behind a forced smile and a promise to answer any additional questions I might have. After he left, I sat in the coffee shop for another 20 minutes, thinking about everything I'd learned during our conversation. Kevin wasn't malicious or intentionally reckless, but he was dangerously naive about the world he wanted to enter. His entire approach to security was reactive rather than proactive, focused on damage control rather than prevention. That mindset might work in the startup world, but it could be catastrophic in defense contracting. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before in my 15-year career. I requested a meeting with my supervisor, Director Patricia Williams, to discuss a potential conflict of interest. Patricia had been with the agency for over 20 years, and she'd seen every possible variation of personal and professional complications that could arise in the security clearance world. "Martinez," she said as I settled into the chair across from her desk, "you look like someone who's wrestling with a difficult decision. What's on your mind?" I explained the situation carefully, without naming Kevin or his company specifically. I described a hypothetical scenario where a family member had requested that I serve as a security clearance reference for a team of people I didn't know well, for work in an industry they'd never operated in before. Patricia listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me thoughtfully. "How well do you know this family member's character?" she asked. "Pretty well," I said. "We grew up together, but I've never seen him in situations that would test the specific qualities needed for classified work." "And the other team members?" "I've met them socially, but I don't have any meaningful professional relationship with any of them." Patricia nodded slowly. "Here's the thing about security clearance references, Martinez. You're not just vouching for someone's general trustworthiness. You're specifically attesting to their suitability for access to classified information. If you can't honestly say that you've observed behaviors that demonstrate that specific kind of reliability, then you shouldn't serve as a reference." "Even for family?" I asked. "Especially for family," Patricia said firmly. "Family relationships can cloud your judgment in both directions. You might overlook red flags because you want to help someone you care about, or you might be overly critical because you know their flaws too well. Either way, your emotional investment makes it harder to provide the kind of objective assessment that the clearance process requires." She paused, studying my expression. "Is this family member someone who's shown genuine respect for your work and expertise in this area?" That question hit harder than I'd expected. I thought about all the times Kevin had dismissed my career, all the family gatherings where my achievements had been minimized or ignored, all the years of being treated like my professional expertise was irrelevant. Not particularly, I admitted. Then why do you think they're asking you now? Because I'm the only person they know who has the credentials they need. Patricia's expression told me she understood exactly what kind of family dynamics were at play here. Martinez, let me share something I learned early in my career. When people suddenly start valuing your expertise only because they need something from you, that tells you everything you need to know about their character. Real respect for your work exists whether they need your help or not. I left Patricia's office with a much clearer understanding of what I needed to do, but I still wasn't ready to give Kevin my final answer. Instead, I decided to conduct my own investigation into his company and his team members. If I was going to make a professional judgment about their suitability for security clearances, I needed more information than Kevin had provided in our coffee shop conversation. I started with public records and business filings, looking for any red flags in the company's financial history or legal standing. What I found was concerning, but not necessarily disqualifying. Kevin's startup had struggled with cash flow issues during its first 2 years, leading to some late payments to vendors and contractors. They'd also had a dispute with a former employee who claimed he hadn't been properly compensated for his contributions to their core technology. The financial problems weren't unusual for a startup, but they raised questions about the company's stability and Kevin's management skills. The employee dispute was more troubling because it suggested potential issues with Kevin's integrity and his ability to handle personnel matters appropriately. Next, I looked into the individual team members who would need security clearances. Frank, Kevin's co-founder, had a solid technical background, but had been involved in a minor controversy at his previous job when he'd left to start the company with Kevin. There were allegations that he'd taken proprietary code with him, though. Nothing had been proven, and no legal action had been taken. The lead developer had an impressive resume, but had been fired from a previous position for what the company described as policy violations. The details weren't public, but any termination for policy violations would be a red flag in a security clearance investigation. The system's architect and project manager seemed clean on paper, but they were both relatively young and had limited professional experience. They'd never worked on projects that required any kind of security protocols, and they'd never been in positions where they had to demonstrate the kind of discretion and reliability that classified work demanded. As I compiled this information, a clearer picture emerged. Kevin's team wasn't necessarily untrustworthy, but they were definitely unprepared for the kind of work they wanted to do. They had technical skills but lacked the professional maturity and security mindset that defense contractors needed. More importantly, they didn't seem to understand that getting security clearances was just the beginning. Maintaining those clearances required ongoing commitment to security protocols, regular lifestyle monitoring, and the kind of personal conduct that could withstand government scrutiny. It wasn't just about being trustworthy enough to get cleared. It was about being disciplined enough to stay cleared. I also reached out to some contacts in the defense contracting community to learn more about the specific Lockheed Martin project Kevin was pursuing. What I discovered was that this wasn't just any cybersecurity contract. It involved developing security protocols for communication systems that would be used in some of the military's most sensitive operations. The work would require not just top-secret clearances, but specialized compartmented access that came with even more stringent requirements. Team members would need to demonstrate not just personal reliability, but the kind of deep commitment to national security that usually came from years of experience in the defense or intelligence communities. When I explained this to one of my contacts, a former military officer who now worked as a security consultant for defense contractors, he was blunt in his assessment. "Sarah, it sounds like your brother's company is trying to run before they can walk," he said. "Cybersecurity for sensitive military communications isn't entry-level defense work. It's the kind of project that established contractors with proven track records compete for. The fact that Lockheed is even considering a startup for this work suggests they're either really impressed with their technical capabilities or they're desperate to find someone who can do the work at the right price point. "What would you recommend?" I asked. "If your brother really wants to break into defense work, he should start with smaller, less sensitive projects and build up his team's security credentials over time. Trying to jump straight into top-secret work is like trying to climb Mount Everest without ever having hiked a mountain before." That conversation crystallized my concerns about Kevin's approach. He was treating this contract opportunity like any other business deal, focused on the financial opportunity rather than the responsibility that came with it. He hadn't considered starting smaller and building up his team's security credentials, gradually. He wanted the biggest, most lucrative contract he could find, regardless of whether his team was ready for it. Meanwhile, the pressure from my family was intensifying. Jessica had started calling me regularly, not to ask about my work or show interest in my life, but to lobby for Kevin's cause. Her conversations followed the same pattern every time. She'd start with small talk, then gradually work her way around, to Kevin's business situation and how stressed he'd been lately. "I really think you should help him," Jessica said during one of these calls. "I mean, your family, right? And it's not like he's asking you to do anything illegal or unethical. He just needs a reference." The fact that Jessica thought serving as a security clearance reference was just a reference told me how little any of them understood what Kevin was actually asking me to do. They saw it as a simple favor, like recommending someone for a job or vouching for their character to a landlord. My parents were more direct in their pressure. My mother called me on a Thursday evening, her voice carrying that particular tone of maternal disappointment that she'd perfected over the years. "Sarah, honey, I don't understand why you're making this so complicated," she said. "Kevin is your brother. He's asking for your help with something important. Isn't that what family does for each other?" "It's not that simple, Mom," I tried to explain. "This isn't just about helping Kevin. It's about my professional responsibilities and the integrity of the security clearance process." "But you work for the government," my mother said, as if that settled the matter. "Surely you can pull some strings or make some calls. You must have influence with these people after all these years." That comment revealed so much about how my family viewed my work. They thought my job was about having influence and pulling strings, rather than following strict protocols and maintaining the highest ethical standards. They thought government work was just another form of networking and relationship management. "It doesn't work that way," I said firmly. "Security clearances aren't favors that get handed out based on personal connections. They're based on thorough investigations and professional assessments of someone's trustworthiness." "Well, surely you can trust your own brother," my mother said, her tone becoming more frustrated. "If you can't vouch for Kevin's character, who can?" That question stayed with me long after we hung up. The truth was that I could vouch for many aspects of Kevin's character. He was intelligent, hardworking, and ambitious. He loved his family and had never done anything deliberately harmful or malicious. Under normal circumstances, he was exactly the kind of person I'd be happy to recommend for a job or a business opportunity. But security clearances weren't about normal circumstances. They were about how someone would behave when they had access to information that could affect national security. They were about whether someone would make the right choices even when those choices conflicted with their personal or financial interests. I'd seen Kevin make questionable decisions when his business interests were at stake. I'd watched him bend rules and cut corners when he thought he could get away with it. I'd observed him prioritize short-term gains over long-term stability. None of these behaviors made him a bad person, but they made him a risky candidate for classified access. The pressure reached its peak when my father called me on a Friday afternoon. Robert Martinez had built his construction business through a combination of hard work, strategic networking, and an ability to recognize opportunities that others missed. He was used to solving problems through persistence and relationship building, and he clearly thought Kevin's clearance issue was just another problem that could be solved through the right connections. "Sarah, I need you to be realistic about this situation," he said without any preliminary small talk. "Kevin's company is on the verge of something really big. This contract could set them up for years, but it's all going to fall apart if you don't help him with this clearance thing." "I understand the stakes, Dad," I said. "But this isn't about what's best for Kevin's business. It's about national security." "Come on," my father said dismissively. "It's cybersecurity work, not nuclear weapons. How sensitive could it really be?" That comment told me everything I needed to know about how little my family understood either my work or Kevin's proposed contract. Cybersecurity for military communications was absolutely critical to national security, and treating it as less important than other classified work showed a fundamental misunderstanding of modern warfare and intelligence operations. "Dad, I can't explain the specifics, but the work Kevin wants to do is extremely sensitive," I said. "The people who do this work need to meet the highest standards of reliability and discretion." "And you don't think your brother meets those standards?" my father asked, his tone shifting toward anger. "You don't think Kevin is reliable enough to handle whatever this job involves?" "I think Kevin is focused on the business opportunity rather than the security responsibility," I said carefully. "And that's exactly the wrong mindset for classified work." My father was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was cold in a way I'd rarely heard before. "You know what I think, Sarah? I think you're jealous. I think you've spent so many years in that government job that you can't stand the idea of Kevin being successful in the private sector. You want to keep him dependent on your approval." That accusation hit me like a physical blow. After 15 years of having my career dismissed and minimized by my family, my father was now suggesting that I was sabotaging Kevin's success out of jealousy. "That's not true," I said, though I could hear my voice shaking slightly. "This has nothing to do with jealousy or competition. This is about my professional responsibilities." "Your professional responsibilities," my father repeated mockingly. "Sarah, you've been hiding behind those professional responsibilities for years. Every time we try to include you in family business discussions, you talk about ethics and protocols. Every time we ask for your help with government-related issues, you lecture us about proper procedures. When is your family going to matter more than your bureaucratic rules?" The conversation ended with my father hanging up on me, but his words echoed in my mind for hours afterward. Was I being unreasonably rigid? Was I letting my professional protocols override my family loyalty? Was I unconsciously sabotaging Kevin because I resented his success? I spent that weekend reviewing everything I knew about the situation, trying to separate my personal feelings from my professional judgment. I reread my notes from the conversation with Kevin, reviewed the research I'd done on his company and team members, and considered the advice I'd received from Patricia and my other colleagues. No matter how I analyzed the situation, I kept coming to the same conclusion. Kevin and his team weren't ready for the kind of work they wanted to do. They had technical skills but lacked the security mindset and professional maturity that classified work required. More importantly, they didn't seem to understand that getting cleared was just the beginning of a long-term commitment to security protocols and ethical behavior. But I also recognized that my family would never understand or accept that conclusion. To them, I would always be the sister who chose bureaucratic rules over family loyalty. They would see my refusal to help Kevin as proof that my government job had made me rigid and unsympathetic to the real-world needs of people trying to build successful businesses. That realization led me to a decision that would change my relationship with my family forever. Instead of simply refusing to serve as Kevin's reference, I decided to conduct my own comprehensive evaluation of his readiness for classified work. I would approach it with the same thoroughness and professionalism that I brought to my government work, documenting everything and following every protocol. If Kevin and his team could demonstrate that they were truly ready for the responsibility of classified access, I would support their applications. But if they couldn't meet the standards that I applied to any other clearance candidate, I would document those deficiencies and explain exactly why I couldn't recommend them. Either way, my family would finally understand that my work involved real expertise and real responsibilities, not just bureaucratic procedures designed to make their lives more difficult. On Monday morning, I called Kevin and asked him to set up a series of formal interviews with each team member who would need clearance. I explained that I would be evaluating them using the same criteria that government investigators would apply, and that I needed complete honesty about their backgrounds, their financial situations, their personal relationships, and their understanding of security protocols. Kevin sounded relieved and excited, clearly interpreting my request as a sign that I was moving toward approving their applications. He didn't seem to understand that I was actually subjecting his team to the kind of scrutiny that might reveal exactly why they weren't ready for classified work. "This is great, Sarah," Kevin said. "I knew you'd come through for us. When do you want to start the interviews?" "We'll start tomorrow," I said. "And Kevin, I want you to understand something. These aren't going to be casual conversations. I'll be asking detailed questions about everyone's background, and I'll be looking for any red flags that might disqualify them from clearance. If I find problems, I'm going to document them." "Of course," Kevin said quickly. "We've got nothing to hide. The whole team is excited to meet with you and show you how serious we are about this opportunity." As I prepared for the interviews, I realized that I was about to put my family relationships to the ultimate test. For 15 years, they'd treated my expertise as irrelevant, but now they were about to experience firsthand what that expertise actually involved. They were about to discover that the paperwork stuff I did for the government required skills, knowledge, and judgment that they'd never bothered to understand or appreciate. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back to the old dynamic where my work was dismissed as unimportant. My family was about to learn exactly what kind of professional I really was, whether they liked the answer or not. The interviews began on Tuesday morning in a small conference room at the Federal Building. I had arranged for each team member to meet with me individually, explaining that this was standard procedure for security clearance evaluations. What they didn't know was that I had also arranged for a colleague from personnel security to observe each interview through a one-way window, providing an additional professional perspective on each candidate. Frank was first, arriving 15 minutes early and dressed in an expensive suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. He was clearly trying to make a good impression, but his nervousness was obvious from the moment he sat down. When people are anxious about security clearance interviews, it usually means they're worried about something specific coming to light. I started with basic background questions, working through his employment history, education, and family relationships. Frank answered confidently until I asked about his departure from his previous job at a major tech company in Silicon Valley. "That was just a misunderstanding," Frank said, his tone becoming defensive. "When I left to start the company with Kevin, my former employer made some accusations about intellectual property. But nothing was ever proven, and no charges were filed." "What kind of accusations?" I asked, making notes. "They claimed I had taken some code with me when I left," Frank said. "But the code I was working on was my own design. I developed it on my own time, using my own resources. Just because I implemented it at their company didn't mean they owned the intellectual property." I paused my note-taking and looked up at Frank. "Did you discuss this interpretation with the company's legal department before implementing the code?" Frank shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Well, no, but I knew what my employment contract said. I wasn't required to run every piece of code past their lawyers." "But when you left the company, did you take copies of any work-related files with you?" "Just my personal projects," Frank said quickly. "Nothing proprietary to the company." "Who determined which files were personal projects versus company property?" Frank was quiet for a long moment. I made that determination myself. That answer was a massive red flag. In any organization that handles sensitive information, employees don't get to make unilateral decisions about what constitutes proprietary versus personal work. The fact that Frank thought this was acceptable showed a fundamental misunderstanding of how security protocols work. I continued the interview for another 30 minutes, asking questions about Frank's financial situation, his personal relationships, and his understanding of security requirements. With each answer, it became clearer that Frank approached rule following as a suggestion rather than a requirement. He'd bent ethics policies at multiple jobs, rationalized questionable financial decisions, and consistently prioritized his personal interests over organizational protocols. The second interview was with Marcus, the lead developer who had been terminated from his previous position for policy violations. Marcus was younger than Frank, probably in his late 20s, and he had the kind of casual confidence that came from being exceptionally good at technical work while never having faced serious consequences for poor judgment. When I asked about his termination, Marcus tried to minimize it as a personality conflict with management. "They said I violated their remote work policy," Marcus explained. "But the policy was stupid and outdated. I was getting my work done, faster and better than anyone else on the team. It shouldn't have mattered where I was doing it from." "What specifically did the policy require?" I asked. "Employees were supposed to work from the office or from pre-approved remote locations within the United States," Marcus said. "But I had an opportunity to spend 3 months in Thailand working from a co-working space in Bangkok. The internet was great. The time zone difference wasn't a big deal, and I was saving a ton of money on living expenses." "Did you request approval for working from Thailand?" "I mentioned it to my manager," Marcus said. "But when he started talking about security protocols and legal complications, I figured it would be easier to just do it and prove that it wasn't a problem." "So you worked from Thailand without authorization?" "For about 6 weeks," Marcus admitted, "and my productivity was higher than ever. I was putting in longer hours because I didn't have the distractions of office life. But then someone from HR noticed that my IP address was showing up as overseas, and they made a big deal about it." Marcus seemed genuinely puzzled that his employer had considered unauthorized overseas work to be a serious violation. He viewed policies as obstacles to efficiency rather than necessary protections for sensitive information. The idea that working from an unauthorized foreign location could create security vulnerabilities had never occurred to him. The third interview was with Sarah Chen, the systems architect. She was the most polished of the three, with a background that included several years at established tech companies and a master's degree from Stanford. But as we talked, I discovered that her technical excellence came with a troubling disregard for non-technical considerations. When I asked about her experience with security protocols, Sarah described them as necessary evils that slowed down development work. "Security requirements are usually written by people who don't understand the technical realities of modern software development," she said. "I've learned to work around them when necessary to deliver products on time." "Can you give me an example of working around security requirements?" "Sure," Sarah said, apparently not recognizing this as a problematic admission. "At my last job, we were developing a financial services application with really strict data encryption requirements. But the encryption protocols they wanted us to use would have made the app so slow that it would have been unusable. So I implemented a more efficient encryption method that provided the same level of security but didn't bog down the system. Did you get approval for the alternative encryption method?" "I tried to explain the technical issues to the security team, but they didn't really understand the performance implications," Sarah said. "So I made the change and documented it thoroughly. The app worked great, and the client was happy with the performance." "What happened when the security team discovered the unauthorized change?" Sarah's expression darkened. "They made me reverse it, even though my method was technically superior. Then we had to ship a product that was significantly slower than it needed to be. all because of bureaucratic inflexibility. Like Frank and Marcus, Sarah saw security requirements as bureaucratic obstacles rather than essential protections. She was confident in her technical abilities, but she had no respect for the non-technical expertise that informed security protocols. In her mind, superior technical skills justified overriding security requirements. The fourth interview was with David Park, the project manager who would be responsible for ensuring that the team followed all security protocols throughout the contract. David was older than the others, probably in his mid-30s, and he had experience managing technical projects at several mid-sized companies. David's interview started promisingly. He understood the importance of following established procedures, and he had experience dealing with compliance requirements in regulated industries. But as we dug deeper into his background, concerning patterns emerged. "Tell me about a time when you had to enforce unpopular policies or procedures," I said. David thought for a moment. "Well, at my last job, we had really strict rules about code reviews and testing procedures. The developers hated them because they slowed down the development cycle, but I understood that the rules were there for good reasons." "How did you handle developer resistance to the procedures?" "I tried to be flexible about implementation," David said. "If a developer could demonstrate that their code was solid and the deadline was tight, I'd sometimes approve shortcuts to the review process. The goal was to ship quality products on time, not to follow every procedure blindly." "Can you be more specific about what kinds of shortcuts you approved?" "Sometimes we'd do abbreviated code reviews instead of full reviews. Sometimes we'd skip certain testing phases if the developer was confident about their work. I made sure to document everything, but I prioritized results over process." David's approach sounded reasonable in a commercial context, but it would be disastrous in classified work. Security protocols for defense projects don't include optional steps or approved shortcuts. Every requirement exists because any deviation could create vulnerabilities that hostile actors could exploit. The final interview was with Kevin himself, and by that point, I already knew what my conclusion would be. But I wanted to give him a fair evaluation, and I was curious to see whether he had a better understanding of security requirements than his team members did. Kevin was confident and articulate, explaining his vision for the company and his commitment to excellence in defense work. He spoke passionately about the technical challenges they would solve and the value they would provide to their government clients. But when I asked specific questions about security protocols, his answers revealed the same dangerous misconceptions that his team members had displayed. "Kevin," I said, "if one of your employees discovered a security vulnerability in a system you were working on, what would be the proper procedure?" "We'd fix it immediately," Kevin said without hesitation. "Security vulnerabilities can't wait for bureaucratic approval processes." "Would you notify the client before implementing the fix?" "If it was a critical vulnerability, we'd fix it first and notify them afterward," Kevin said. "You can't leave security holes open while you wait for paperwork approval." "What if fixing the vulnerability required changing specifications that had been approved by the client?" Kevin looked puzzled. "If the specifications created security vulnerabilities, then obviously they needed to be changed. The client would want us to fix the problem, not follow flawed specifications." These answers demonstrated that Kevin had no understanding of how classified systems work. In defense contracting, you don't make unilateral changes to approved specifications, even to fix security problems. You follow established procedures for reporting vulnerabilities and requesting authorization for modifications. Unauthorized changes, even well-intentioned ones, are security violations that can result in criminal charges. After completing all 5 interviews, I spent 2 days reviewing my notes and consulting with my colleague who had observed the sessions. Her assessment aligned with mine. Kevin's team had impressive technical capabilities, but completely lacked the security mindset required for classified work. They thought security protocols were suggestions rather than requirements, They prioritized efficiency over compliance. They believed their technical expertise gave them authority to override security procedures. Most dangerously, they didn't understand that unauthorized actions, even those taken with good intentions, constituted security violations in the classified environment. On Friday afternoon, I called Kevin and asked him to meet me for a final conversation. This time, I suggested we meet at my office in the federal building. I wanted him to see the environment where I worked, to understand the seriousness of the security measures that surrounded classified work every day. Kevin arrived at the appointed time, going through the same security screening that I experienced every morning. He seemed impressed by the metal detectors, the badge readers, and the armed security guards. It was probably the first time he'd really considered what it meant to work in a secure facility. I led him to a small conference room and closed the door. On the table in front of me, I had placed a thick folder containing my interview notes, background research, and professional assessment of his team's readiness for classified work. "Kevin," I said, "I've completed my evaluation of your team's suitability for security clearances." "Great," Kevin said, leaning forward eagerly. "What's the verdict?" "I cannot recommend any member of your team for classified access at this time," I said clearly. "Based on my interviews and research, I believe that your team lacks the security mindset and procedural discipline required for defense work." Kevin stared at me for a long moment, as if he was having trouble processing what I'd said. "What do you mean you can't recommend us?" "We answered all your questions honestly. We've got clean backgrounds and excellent technical skills." "Technical skills aren't enough," I explained. "Defense work requires absolute adherence to security protocols, even when those protocols seem inefficient or unnecessary. Your entire team demonstrated a pattern of prioritizing results over procedures, which is exactly the wrong approach for classified environments." "Can you be more specific?" Kevin asked, his tone becoming defensive. I opened the folder and began reading from my notes. Frank's unauthorized appropriation of intellectual property, Marcus's violation of remote work policies, Sarah's implementation of unauthorized encryption methods, David's approval of procedural shortcuts, Kevin's willingness to make unilateral changes to approved specifications. With each example, Kevin's expression grew more frustrated. "Sarah, these are minor issues. Everyone in the tech industry deals with these kinds of situations. You're making mountains out of molehills." "In the commercial tech industry, these might be minor issues," I agreed. "But in defense work, any deviation from approved procedures is a potential security violation. The kind of flexibility that's valued in startup environments is dangerous when you're dealing with classified information." Kevin stood up from his chair, pacing to the window that overlooked downtown Phoenix. "So, what are you saying? That we need to completely change how we operate? That we need to become bureaucratic robots who follow every rule blindly?" "I'm saying that you need to understand the difference between commercial work and defense work," I replied. "The protocols exist for reasons that go beyond efficiency or convenience. They're designed to protect information that could affect national security if it falls into the wrong hands." "But we're cybersecurity experts," Kevin protested. "We understand the importance of protecting sensitive information. We've been doing it for years in the commercial sector." "Commercial cybersecurity and defense cybersecurity operate under completely different assumptions," I explained. "In commercial work, you're protecting against opportunistic hackers and financial criminals. In defense work, you're protecting against sophisticated nation-state actors who have unlimited resources and years to plan their attacks. The threat model is completely different, which means the security requirements are completely different." Kevin returned to his chair, slumping into it with obvious disappointment. "So that's it? You're just going to kill this opportunity because we don't follow bureaucratic procedures the way you think we should?" "I'm making a professional assessment based on 15 years of experience in the classified environment," I said firmly. Your team isn't ready for the responsibility that comes with access to classified information. That doesn't mean you can never be ready, but it means you need to develop a different approach to security and compliance. What would it take? Kevin asked quietly. What would we need to do to get your approval? I had anticipated this question, and I'd prepared a detailed response. I pulled out a second document from my folder, one that outlined a comprehensive program for developing the security mindset and procedural discipline that Kevin's team would need. First, your entire team would need to complete formal training in security protocols and classification procedures, I said. Not just online courses, but intensive training that includes hands-on exercises and real-world scenarios. Kevin nodded, making notes on his phone. Second, you'd need to demonstrate your commitment to security by implementing formal procedures in your current commercial work. Document control, access restrictions, audit trails, incident reporting procedures. Show that you can follow protocols, even when they're inconvenient. Okay, Kevin said. What else? Third, you'd need to gain experience working with organizations that have strict compliance requirements. Government contractors, financial institutions, healthcare companies, places where procedural violations have serious consequences. Kevin's note-taking slowed as he realized the scope of what I was describing. Fourth, you'd need to build relationships within the defense and intelligence communities. Attend conferences, join professional organizations, network with people who understand the culture and requirements of classified work. How long would all of this take? Kevin asked. Probably 2 to 3 years, I said honestly. Maybe longer, depending on how quickly your team can adapt to the different mindset required for defense work. Kevin set down his phone and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't anger or frustration, but something closer to genuine confusion. Sarah, he said slowly, I had no idea that your work involved this level of expertise. I thought security clearances were just background checks and paperwork. I didn't realize there was so much specialized knowledge involved. Most people don't, I replied, which is why I've spent 15 years being treated like I push papers around all day. Kevin was quiet for a long moment, staring at the folder of documents on the table between us. When he finally spoke, his voice was subdued. I think I owe you an apology, he said. I've been dismissive of your work for years, and I never bothered to understand what you actually do. I just assumed that government jobs were easier than private sector work, that you were playing it safe instead of taking real risks. And now? I asked. Now I'm starting to understand that what you do requires a completely different kind of expertise than what I do, Kevin said. I'm good at building technology and managing business relationships. But you're an expert in something I don't understand at all. It was probably the most honest conversation Kevin and I had ever had about our respective careers. For the first time, he was acknowledging that my work required real expertise, not just bureaucratic compliance. The thing is, Kevin continued, I can't wait 2 or 3 years to pursue this contract. My company needs revenue now. We've got investors to answer to and employees to pay. If I can't move forward with this Lockheed Martin opportunity, I'll have to find other ways to keep the business viable. I understand, I said, and I'm sorry that I can't give you the recommendation you need right now. But I hope you understand why I can't compromise my professional standards, even for family. Kevin nodded slowly. I do understand. I don't like it, but I understand it. We sat in silence for a few minutes, both of us processing the implications of my decision. Finally, Kevin gathered his things and stood up to leave. Sarah, he said as he reached the door, what happens now? I mean, between us as a family? It was a question I'd been dreading, because I knew that my refusal to help Kevin would be seen as a betrayal by the rest of my family. They would never understand or accept my professional reasoning. To them, I would always be the sister who chose her job over her family. I don't know, I said honestly. But I hope that eventually everyone will understand that this decision was about maintaining professional integrity, not about hurting you or your business. Kevin left without saying anything else, and I remained in the conference room for another hour, thinking about what had just happened. For the first time in 15 years, someone in my family had acknowledged that my work required real expertise and professional judgment. But that acknowledgement had come at the cost of destroying Kevin's most important business opportunity. I knew that the conversation I'd just had with Kevin was only the beginning. Soon, I would have to face my parents, Jessica, and the rest of the family with the news that I had refused to help Kevin when he needed me most. They would demand explanations that I couldn't provide without violating confidentiality rules. They would accuse me of being inflexible, unsupportive, and disloyal. But for the first time in my career, I felt completely confident that I had made the right professional decision. Kevin's team wasn't ready for classified work, and no amount of family pressure could change that fundamental fact. My responsibility was to protect national security, not to enable my brother's business ambitions. As I gathered my documents and prepared to leave the office, I realized that this decision would define my relationship with my family for years to come. They could either accept that my work involved real responsibilities and professional standards, or they could continue to see me as someone who chose bureaucratic rules over family loyalty. Either way, I had finally demonstrated that my dead-end government job required exactly the kind of expertise and professional judgment that they had never bothered to understand or respect. The silence in my apartment that evening was different from any quiet I'd experienced before. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a job well done, or the comfortable silence of solitude. It was the heavy silence that comes after making a decision that you know will change everything, even when you're certain it's the right decision. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my balcony, looking out over the Phoenix skyline as the sun set behind the mountains. My phone had been buzzing intermittently all afternoon, but I'd turned off the notifications. I knew the calls were coming from my family, and I knew what those conversations would involve. Kevin had undoubtedly shared the news of my decision by now, and everyone would want explanations, justifications, and probably some form of reconsideration. But I wasn't ready for those conversations yet. I needed time to process what had happened and to prepare for the family confrontation that was inevitable. For 15 years, I'd been the invisible family member whose work was dismissed as unimportant. Now I demonstrated exactly how important that work was by refusing to compromise its integrity, even for family. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family would finally understand the significance of my career only in the context of my refusal to help them. The first call I answered came at 8:30 that evening. It was my mother, and her voice carried a mixture of confusion and disappointment that made my chest tighten. "Sarah, honey, Kevin told us what happened," she said without any preliminary greeting. "He said you won't help him with his security clearance application. I don't understand what's going on." "It's complicated, Mom," I said, choosing my words carefully. I evaluated Kevin's team using the same professional standards I'd apply to any security clearance applicant, and I determined that they're not ready for classified work. "But they're good people," my mother protested. "Kevin's your brother, and Frank's been his partner for years. Surely you can trust them with whatever this job involves." Personal trust and professional suitability for classified work are two different things, I explained. Security clearances require specific qualifications and demonstrated reliability in handling sensitive information. It's not about whether I like someone or trust them in general. My mother was quiet for a moment, and I could hear my father's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. "Your father wants to talk to you," my mother said finally. My father's voice came on the line with barely controlled anger. "Sarah, I want you to explain to me why you're willing to destroy your brother's business over some bureaucratic procedure." "I'm not destroying anything, Dad," I said firmly. "I'm making a professional assessment based on 15 years of experience in the classified environment. Kevin's team isn't ready for the responsibility that comes with access to classified information. That's ridiculous, my father said. Kevin's team includes some of the smartest technical people in Phoenix. They've built successful businesses and managed complex projects. What more do you need? I need people who understand that security protocols aren't suggestions, I said. I need people who will follow established procedures even when those procedures seem inefficient or unnecessary. I need people who understand that unauthorized actions, even well-intentioned ones, can have serious consequences in the classified environment. You're talking about paperwork and procedures, my father said dismissively. This is about real work that could benefit national security. Isn't that more important than following every bureaucratic rule perfectly? That comment revealed everything. I needed to know about how little my family understood my work, even now. They still thought security protocols were arbitrary bureaucratic requirements rather than essential protections for sensitive information. Dad, those bureaucratic rules exist because real work in national security requires absolute reliability, I explained. Every protocol, every procedure, every requirement exists because deviation could create vulnerabilities that hostile actors could exploit. Kevin's team has a pattern of prioritizing results over procedures, which is exactly the wrong mindset for classified work. So, you're going to punish Kevin because his team thinks outside the box? My father asked. Because they're creative problem solvers instead of bureaucratic robots? I'm not punishing anyone, I said, feeling my own anger rising. I'm making the same professional assessment I'd make for any clearance applicant. The fact that Kevin is my brother doesn't change the security requirements or my responsibility to uphold them. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with my father alternating between attempts at persuasion and outright accusations. He suggested that I was jealous of Kevin's success, that I was being vindictive over years of perceived slights, that I was hiding behind professional rules to avoid supporting my family. Each accusation stung, but they also confirmed something I'd suspected for years. My family would never truly understand or respect the work I did. When the call finally ended, I felt emotionally drained but professionally vindicated. I'd spent 15 years having my expertise dismissed and minimized, but I'd maintained my professional integrity when it mattered most. That had to count for something, even if my family couldn't see it. The next morning brought a text message from Jessica asking if we could meet for coffee. Her message was carefully worded, emphasizing that she wanted to understand my perspective and hear my side of the story. It was more diplomatic than I'd expected from Jessica, but I agreed to meet her, curious to see whether she would be more receptive to my reasoning than my parents had been. We met at a small cafe in Central Phoenix, one of those trendy places, where Jessica often took photos for her social media content. She arrived a few minutes late, looking uncharacteristically serious and subdued. "Thanks for meeting with me," Jessica said as she sat down across from me. "I know yesterday was probably difficult for everyone." "It was," I agreed, "but it was the right decision professionally." Jessica stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "Sarah, I need to be honest with you. I don't really understand what you do for work. I know you work for the government, and I know it involves security clearances and classified information, but I've never really grasped why it's so complicated." It was refreshing to hear someone in my family admit their ignorance rather than dismissing my work based on assumptions. "What would you like to know?" I asked. "Well, for starters, why can't you just vouch for Kevin's character and let the government investigators handle the detailed background checks?" Jessica said. "Isn't that how references usually work?" "Security clearance references aren't like job references," I explained. "When I serve as a reference for someone's clearance application, I'm not just saying that I think they're a good person. I'm making a professional assessment of their suitability for access to classified information. That assessment becomes part of their official file. And if I'm wrong, it reflects on my own judgment and potentially my own clearance." Jessica nodded slowly. So, if you recommended Kevin and he later violated security protocols, you could get in trouble too? Yes, I said. And more importantly, any security violation could potentially harm national security. That's why the standards are so high, and why references have to be absolutely certain about their assessments. But Kevin's a good person, Jessica said. He's not going to betray his country or sell secrets to foreign governments. I'm sure he's not, I agreed. But security violations don't require malicious intent. They can result from carelessness, poor judgment, or simply not understanding the gravity of security requirements. Based on my interviews with Kevin's team, I believe they would be high-risk candidates for accidental violations. Jessica was quiet for a moment, processing what I'd told her. When she spoke again, her voice was more subdued. Sarah, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you feel like our family has never appreciated your work? The question caught me off guard, both because of its directness and because it suggested that Jessica had been paying more attention to family dynamics than I'd realized. Sometimes, I said carefully, I think my work exists in a world that's very different from what everyone else in the family does, and it's been hard for people to understand or relate to it. I think we've been unfair to you, Jessica said quietly. I've always assumed that government work was stable but boring, that you were playing it safe instead of taking risks like Kevin does with his startups. But listening to you explain the security clearance process, I'm starting to realize that your work involves a lot more responsibility and expertise than I understood. It was the first time anyone in my family had acknowledged that my career might involve real expertise rather than just bureaucratic compliance. I appreciate that, I said, but I want you to understand that my decision about Kevin's clearance application isn't about proving a point or getting recognition for my work. It's about my professional responsibility to protect classified information. I know, Jessica said, and I think I'm starting to understand why that responsibility has to come first, even when it affects family. We talked for another hour, and by the end of our conversation, I felt like Jessica had a much better understanding of both my work and my decision regarding Kevin's application. She wasn't happy about the impact on Kevin's business, but she seemed to accept that I'd made the decision based on legitimate professional considerations, rather than personal animosity. As we were preparing to leave, Jessica said something that surprised me. Sarah, I've been thinking about pivoting my business toward corporate clients, including government agencies. Would you be willing to give me some advice about how that market works? Of course, I said, but understand that I can't help you get government contracts or influence any procurement decisions. I can only provide general information about how government agencies operate and what they look for in contractors. I understand, Jessica said. I'm not looking for special treatment. I just want to understand the market better so I can make informed decisions about whether it's worth pursuing. It was a mature approach that demonstrated more understanding of professional boundaries than I'd expected from Jessica. More importantly, it suggested that she was beginning to see my expertise as valuable in its own right, not just as a tool for helping family members achieve their business goals. That afternoon, I received a call from Kevin. His voice was different from our previous conversations, more subdued and thoughtful. Sarah, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, he said. I talked to my team about your assessment, and we've been discussing what it would take to address the concerns you raised. Okay, I said, curious about where this was heading. The thing is, we've realized that we don't really understand the world we're trying to enter, Kevin said. We know cybersecurity technology, but we don't know defense culture or government, contracting or security protocols. We've been approaching this like any other business opportunity, but it's obviously much more complex than that. It is, I agreed. So I wanted to ask you something, Kevin continued. Would you be willing to consult with us on developing a long-term strategy for entering the defense market? Not as a clearance reference, but as a subject matter expert Who can help us understand what we need to learn and do to become viable candidates for classified work? The request surprised me. Kevin was essentially acknowledging that he needed my expertise to navigate a world he didn't understand, and he was willing to pay for that expertise rather than expecting it as a family favor. I'd be interested in discussing that, I said. But I want to be clear about the scope and limitations of any consulting relationship. I can provide general guidance about defense contracting and security requirements, but I can't influence specific procurement decisions or clearance determinations. I understand, Kevin said. We're not looking for special treatment. We're looking for education. We want to understand what we don't know so we can make informed decisions about whether this market is worth pursuing and what it would take to succeed in it. We arranged to meet the following week to discuss a potential consulting arrangement. As I hung up the phone, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with Kevin. For the first time, he was approaching me as a professional with valuable expertise, rather than as a family member who should automatically support his interests. The shift became even more apparent during a family dinner the following Sunday. My parents had invited everyone over for what they described as a family meeting to discuss the Kevin situation. I arrived expecting another round of arguments and accusations, but the tone was different from what I'd anticipated. "Sarah," my father said as we gathered around the dining room table, "Kevin has explained to us that your decision about his clearance application was based on professional standards rather than personal considerations." "That's correct," I said. "He's also explained that the security requirements for defense work are more complex than we understood," my mother added. "We didn't realize that your work involved that level of expertise and responsibility." It was a grudging acknowledgement, but it was more recognition than I'd received from my parents in 15 years of government service. "I appreciate that," I said. "I know my decision created problems for Kevin's business, and I wish the situation could have been different. But I couldn't compromise my professional standards, even for family." "We understand that now," my father said, though his tone suggested he still wasn't entirely happy about it. "Kevin also told us that you might be willing to help his company understand the defense market better, as a consultant rather than as a reference. We've discussed that possibility," I confirmed. "If Kevin's serious about pursuing defense work long-term, there's a lot he needs to learn about how that market operates." "And you'd charge him for that advice?" my mother asked, sounding somewhat surprised. "If it's a formal consulting arrangement, yes," I said. "Professional expertise has value, whether it's provided to family members or anyone else." The conversation continued for another hour, covering Kevin's business plans, the family's understanding of my work, and the boundaries between professional and personal relationships. It wasn't entirely comfortable, but it was more honest and substantive than most family discussions we'd had about my career. As the evening was winding down, my father said something that surprised me. "Sarah, I owe you an apology," he said. "I've spent years assuming that your government job was less challenging and important than private sector work. I thought you were playing it safe instead of taking real risks. But seeing how seriously you take your professional responsibilities, even when it costs you personally, has made me realize that your work requires a different kind of courage than I understood." It wasn't a complete reversal of his attitude toward my career, but it was an acknowledgement that my work involved real expertise and real responsibility. Coming from my father, who had spent years dismissing government work as bureaucratic busy work, it felt like a significant shift. Over the following months, my relationship with my family continued to evolve. Kevin hired me as a consultant to help his company develop a strategic plan for entering the defense market. The work was challenging and rewarding, involving everything from training his team on security protocols to helping them understand the cultural differences between commercial and government contracting. More importantly, the consulting relationship gave Kevin a much deeper appreciation for the expertise I'd developed over 15 years of government service. He began referring other companies to me for similar guidance, and word-of-mouth referrals led to additional consulting opportunities with businesses trying to navigate the complex world of government contracting. Jessica also followed through on her interest in pursuing government clients, though she approached it with much more preparation and patience than Kevin had initially shown. She spent months learning about government procurement processes, attending industry conferences, and building relationships with people who understood the federal market. When she finally submitted her first proposal for government work, it was thoughtful, compliant, and competitive. My parents gradually began asking more substantive questions about my work, showing genuine interest in understanding what I did, rather than just making polite conversation. They started inviting my colleagues to family gatherings, treating them as interesting professionals rather than generic government employees. The change wasn't dramatic or immediate, but it was real. For the first time in my adult life, my family saw my career as valuable and worthy of respect rather than as a consolation prize or a safe backup plan. The most significant change, however, was in how I saw myself and my work. For years, I'd allowed my family's dismissive attitude to make me question the value of my career. Despite the satisfaction I found in my daily responsibilities and the recognition I received from my colleagues and supervisors, standing up to family pressure and maintaining my professional standards had reminded me why I'd chosen government service in the first place. It wasn't just about job security or steady paychecks. It was about serving something larger than myself, about protecting information and systems that were critical to national security, about being part of an institution that defended the country I loved. My decision to refuse Kevin's clearance application had been professionally necessary, but it had also been personally liberating. I'd finally demonstrated to my family and to myself that my work involved real expertise, real responsibility, and real courage. I'd shown that I was willing to prioritize professional integrity over family harmony, which was exactly the kind of character trait that made someone suitable for classified work. 6 months after our confrontation over the security clearances, Kevin's company successfully won a smaller government contract that didn't require classified access. It was less lucrative than the Lockheed Martin opportunity, but it gave his team valuable experience working with government clients and following government procedures. During the contract performance, Kevin called me several times for advice on compliance issues and procedural questions. Each conversation reinforced his understanding of why security protocols were so important and why my initial assessment of his team's readiness had been accurate. "Sarah," he said during one of these calls, "I need to tell you something. When you first refused to recommend us for clearances, I thought you were being unnecessarily rigid and bureaucratic. But working on this government contract has shown me how different this environment is from commercial work. The attention to detail, the documentation requirements, the compliance monitoring, it's like a completely different world." "It is a different world," I agreed. "And it requires a different mindset and different skills than most people realize." "I'm starting to understand why you couldn't recommend us," Kevin said. "We weren't ready for this level of responsibility, and we probably would have made mistakes that could have damaged both our reputation and yours." It was the acknowledgement I'd been waiting for, though I'd never explicitly asked for it. Kevin finally understood that my decision had been based on legitimate professional concerns rather than personal animosity or family jealousy. A year later, Kevin's company applied for facility security clearance to pursue more advanced government contracts. This time, they approached the process with proper preparation, comprehensive training, and realistic expectations about the time and effort required. When they asked me to serve as a reference, I was able to provide a positive recommendation based on their demonstrated commitment to security protocols and their proven ability to handle government work responsibly. The security clearance process took 18 months, but Kevin's team was eventually approved for secret-level access. They're now working on several defense contracts, providing valuable cybersecurity services while maintaining the highest standards of security and compliance. More importantly, Kevin and his team have become advocates for proper security protocols within the defense contractor community. They understand that security requirements aren't bureaucratic obstacles, but essential protections for sensitive information and critical systems. My family still doesn't fully understand all the details of what I do for work, but they no longer dismiss it as unimportant or uninteresting. They've learned that government service requires specialized expertise, that security protocols serve essential purposes, and that professional integrity sometimes requires difficult personal decisions. I continue to work as an intelligence analyst for the Department of Homeland Security, but I've also developed a thriving consulting practice helping companies navigate the complex world of government contracting. The work is challenging and rewarding, combining my government experience with my newfound appreciation for the value of private sector innovation. Most importantly, I've learned that professional expertise and personal integrity aren't negotiable, even when family relationships are at stake. Standing up for my professional standards wasn't just about protecting classified information or maintaining security protocols. It was about respecting the importance of my own work and demanding that others respect it as well. My dead-end government job turned out to be anything but dead-end. It was the foundation for a career that combined public service with private sector consulting, government expertise with family business, professional integrity with personal relationships. It just took a family crisis and a security clearance controversy for everyone, including me, to understand the true value of what I'd been building for 15 years. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family finally understood the importance of my work only when I refused to compromise it for their benefit. But sometimes the most important lessons come from the most difficult decisions. And sometimes standing up for your principles is the only way to earn the respect you deserve. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.